G'day ladies and gents, Cubic Media here. 1.21 is finally out, which means auto crafters, the trial chambers, and falling waterlogged scaffolding. You heard me. Apart from the highly publicized features of this update, there have been a lot of interesting technical changes, in particular with portals. Before 1.21, the behavior of different types of portals was extremely inconsistent. Nether portals would load chunks, end portals and end gateways not so much. Some entities could use some portals, but not others. And sometimes portals would just not work depending on the circumstances. But at some point during the development of 1.21, Mojang has finally done an overhaul of portal logic and allowed all sorts of new possibilities with portals, such as allowing entities to generate portals, allowing TNT to use portals. Want to get the ultimate revenge on somebody? Well, just spam TNT into a portal and replace their entire base with an obsidian monolith. Actually, maybe some things with portals shouldn't be allowed. But one of the more substantial changes is that falling blocks can now use nether portals. Okay, so what? Lots of entities can use portals now. However, falling blocks are special because they can contain block state data. Too bad it's not actually possible to obtain falling scaffolding in its waterlogged block state. However, notice how if you place a scaffolding block so that it falls into a water source, it will become waterlogged. And some very clever people, such as Sava, looked into the code and found something extremely interesting. When our scaffolding block changes from a block to an entity, it will always default to the waterlogged false state. However, this means when it goes to land in a water source, it will replace that water source with a normal scaffolding block. It turns out that to allow the falling scaffolding to land in the waterlogged state, in the same tick that it detects a place that it wants to land, with water inside, it will set its block state to being waterlogged and then it will land. However, this block state conversion happens in the same tick that it lands, meaning that even though the waterlogged scaffolding technically exists as a falling block, it will be deleted in the same tick is created, and thus there is no way to actually interact with it. That is, unless there was a way to simply stop Minecraft's code from executing before it changes back into a block. This means update suppression, which brings us all the way back to 1.18 when Mojang first declared war on suppressing updates.
Let's play a fun game. Let's see how quick Mojang is this time, because I'm not gonna fully reveal how it is done. Patch me if you can.
Yeah, thanks Doc. But honestly, this change was bound to happen eventually, as while a lot of the broken behaviors were useful, like shadow items and portal slicing, most of them would simply crash the game, or allow you to dupe the living crap out of items. So with a rework of the update scheduling system in 1.19, Stack Overflow exception was gone, and by 1.19.4 the tiny trapdoor suppressor was also patched. And in 1.20, class cast exception was also fixed, rendering these suppression boxes completely impotent. Igna, who is one of the leading researchers into update suppression past 1.19, has even found code being implemented in newer versions to preemptively limit the scope of future suppression exploits. So as of 1.21, update suppression is properly dead and essentially unusable, especially for large-scale technical projects. But WaveTech, the server that I play on, is still in 1.19.4, and we have these suppression boxes scattered around the server for performing the class cast exception method. So here is my simple suppressor, which uses a CCE suppressor that I stole from Andre, a fellow WaveTech member. Let's go through the process step by step by freezing the game and placing our scaffolding block. Because our scaffolding is 8 blocks away from the nearest supporting block, it will immediately become a falling block entity. We also detect the placement with this observer to start this timing circuit, which is important for when the scaffolding goes to land. Now, when the scaffolding detects a surface for it to land on, it will first set its block state, then it will place the scaffolding block, then it will try to delete the falling block entity in the same subtick sequence. When the scaffolding block is placed, however, it sends a block update through this rail into our update suppressor, which stops the execution of the code before it can delete the falling block entity. By the way, this is the behavior used to duplicate gravity blocks using end portals, except in this case, the entity simply teleports to another dimension after placing its physical block. It's honestly amazing to think that this behavior was first used over 8 years ago by technical giants such as Panda and 202 Name to make blocks such as sand renewable. You might remember this design and its many variations from when Razeworks decided he should take credit for gravity block dupers, and even went as far as encouraging his audience to harass players who use gravity block duper designs without crediting him. As participants of the technical community, we should always be considerate of where our ideas come from, but nobody should be forced to think about somebody because they demand to be noticed. If you're a fan of Razeworks and watch his content, you should be ashamed of him and his continuing behavior towards the technical community. Actually, that makes me think, what will happen when we send a falling scaffolding block to the end dimension after it's placed its block state? So this simple setup, we launch it through the portal, and it lands in the waterlog state. I wonder if the entity that went through the portal is also in its waterlog state. No. No waterlog falling scaffolding block, I'm afraid. Was definitely worth checking because that would have been huge. So now we are at the end of our tick. We have our falling waterlog scaffolding, as well as the waterlog scaffolding block which has been placed on this shulker box. If we tick another step like so, the shulker box gets broken by this fence gate moving into its position, which happens in the block event phase. Block events are processed before entities, and so now our falling scaffolding sees no supporting block underneath it, and so it will continue to fall as a waterlog scaffolding block. And the best part about this setup is that we can automatically place back the shulker box so that the setup is ready to use again. However, you might notice a slight discrepancy in that each time we create a waterlog scaffolding, we will actually cause a game crash. To be able to simulate the effects of crashing the game without having to actually restart my game every single time, I'm using the carpet rule Yeet Update Suppression Crash provided by TIS Carpet Edition. So now that we have the waterlog falling scaffolding block, what do we actually do with it? Well, with Update Suppression 1.19, it's pretty easy to create the falling waterlog scaffolding. However, we can't make the falling block entity use a nether portal until we get to 1.21. So what we need is a way to stockpile the falling block entities without them converting back into their block form. An obvious solution might be to use a bubble column like this. However, because of a parameter called time, eventually the falling block entity will die, and this happens when the timer reaches 600 ticks, which translates to only 30 seconds. A much better storage solution involves the use of a moving piston, because while the falling block entity is inside of a block that's being moved by a piston, it holds onto something known as the on ground tag, which prevents the item from breaking even when it's over its 600 game tick timer. The moving piston will also prevent the falling block from landing and becoming a normal block. This setup seems to work pretty well, but in terms of being a long-term solution, there is a chance if you unload and reload the setup that the piston stops moving, and then your falling block entities will instantly break because their timers are up. By the way, we just observed a behavior known as block event culling, where block events scheduled by something like a moving piston can be lost and forgotten when chunks are unloaded and loaded again. This is just one example of the many ways that a redstone contraption can break when being unloaded. So moving pistons are a pretty good solution, however aren't reliable if you're relying on, well, a moving piston. What we need is a way to make a block continuously moving like it's being pushed by a piston without needing to be scheduled through block events. And fortunately, our good old friend Update Suppression has a solution for this. A block, when it starts being moved by a piston, gets converted into a block entity known as the moving piston block, or the infamous block 36 if you're familiar with Minecraft before 1.12. The moving piston block entity is what actually plays the animation of the block moving. It also schedules the removal of the block at its previous position and the placement of the block at its next position. With this setup, the dead coral block is going to send a block update when it attempts to break as we move this slime block, and that block update will cause an exception in the moment where the block 36 or moving piston is created in the position of this slime block. And what that's going to do is suppress the removal of the moving piston block, which contains the data of the slime block. But if we then go ahead and reload the area, what is left in this space is something known as a dataless moving piston. There is actually a block in this empty space, but it's invisible because it doesn't have any data associated with it. If I go ahead and place a block such as a wall underneath our dataless moving piston, the hitbox from the wall will prevent our falling scaffolding from landing, and the fact that there is a moving piston here will prevent the falling scaffolding from trying to break. This gives us a perfectly stable long-term storage solution for our falling block entities. So I guess all we need to do now is just close our world, update to 121, and send this bad boy through a nether portal. However, there is a small detail to note. While our falling block entity is loaded, its timer is going to be continuously incrementing. And provided the timer is over 600 ticks or 30 seconds, pretty much the instant that we try to move it into a situation where it's no longer in a block 36, it will immediately break. One way to overcome this problem will be to give the falling block entity some sideways momentum with a slime block as it goes through the portal, and then make sure that the falling block has somewhere to land the instant that it exits the portal. And just like that, you have water source blocks in the nether dimension. But assuming you want to generate more water, you will need at least 2 of these bad boys. But then begins the tedious process of transporting them with pistons. However, this now gives me an idea that is completely insane. This process of transporting the waterlogged source blocks using sticky pistons works in practice, however, would be extremely tedious to implement if you want to use it for all sorts of water-based projects throughout the nether. But what if you could have water sources delivered anywhere in your nether dimension on demand? We have the technology to deliver falling block entities anywhere in a Minecraft world. So what if you could simply punch in some coordinates and have some infinite water sources magically fall from the sky wherever you need them? This will be Operation Hellstorm, an orbital strike cannon for the WaveTech server which can deliver water sources anywhere in the nether for when we update to 1.21. The first problem to solve is the lifetime of our falling block entities, because if the timers are too high, then the delivery of our waterlogged scaffolding blocks turns out to be very anticlimactic. And because there's no way to obtain the waterlogged scaffolding in 121, we'll need to stockpile the falling blocks like ammunition for the cannon before we update. What we'll need to do is get the falling waterlogged scaffolding entities out of the player's render distance as quickly as possible so that the entities aren't having their timers processed. One potential solution could be to use a really long slime block conveyor like so. However, this is really slow and we lose a lot of time on our falling block entities. No, obviously the superior solution is to use a buttload of TNT to simply launch the falling block outside of render distance as quickly as possible. That way, we lose minimal time on our falling block entities. So all we need to do with this design is simply flick this lever to start a 20 game tick clock, allowing us to generate a waterlogged falling scaffolding block every single second. And here we are at the edge of Steve's render distance, where our falling scaffolding block entities are being delivered straight into unloaded chunks where they will no longer process their timers. If we use Tweakeroo's entity ticking toggle like so, we can now go over to where our falling block entities have been stockpiling. Here they are. And with this simple setup, when we update to 121, we can first align our falling block entities and then entity separate them like so. So this gives us a basic idea of how we can create the falling block entities, store them in unloaded chunks to preserve their timers, and then extract them through a portal when the time comes to deliver them into the nether. The next step is to design an orbital strike cannon for the nether dimension. To start with, let's figure out where we want to actually build the cannon by taking a look at a map of Wavetek's nether dimension. This massive area is the mega nether perimeter and it's freaking huge. For reference, the red grid lines represent region files, which are collections of 1024 chunks. Currently the area is about 5,000 blocks wide and 4,000 blocks long, and you can see to the north that the area is always expanding. You can also see waypoints representing the server's various points of interest. To find a suitable location for the cannon, we want to consider a place which is fairly remote, but not too remote such that it is a pain to get to. So ideally we want the cannon to be outside the mega nether perimeter, but still fairly close and accessible. We also want there to be a suppression box easily accessible on the overworld side of this location. If we take a look south, we get to an area of the server known as Brazil. This is one of the most remote locations housing one of Wavetek's oldest quarries. If we go to the overworld side of Brazil in Spectator like so, here we can see the quarry and the enormous area that is dug out. So this is a pretty remote location, however unfortunately there does not seem to be any suppression boxes here whatsoever. So probably the next best location to consider would be Mexico, the location of another newer quarry. Heading over to Mexico in Spectator, we can find the Mexico quarry storage as well as a suppression box. So I think the best place to put the cannon would be slightly west of Mexico, because from there the cannon will be fairly out of the way, and in particular the overworld side should also be pretty remote, giving very little reason for anyone to go there and ruin our falling block entities while they're in storage. The next thing to consider is the design brief, where JKM, one of the oldest and most experienced technical players, would like the cannon to be omnidirectional and reach the overworld border from the nether dimension, which is about 4 million blocks in every direction. This is a bit tricky now, because the last orbital strike cannon with omnidirectional fire control was the very first iteration of the design. And I really need to point out that the omnidirectional firing provided by the first orbital strike cannon is a massive hack. With my lack of experience in cannon tech combined with massive restrictions of omnidirectional firing on the cannon's design, I couldn't even get the propelling TNT aligned within the 4-second fuse time, meaning I had to use a lazy chunk to help get the TNT into position for omnidirectional firing. Falling block entities also have a lot of unusual behaviors which needed special components, leaving very little room for further wiring optimizations, forcing the design to be completely blown out of proportion, with these enormous dupers needing a dedicated duper for each axis and needing to build the cannon in the sky where it could easily be found. This is why in the second iteration of the cannon, I sacrificed omnidirectional firing to make the cannon smaller and easier to conceal. However, because Operation Hellstorm is not a weapons platform, we don't need to worry about compactness and concealment. We can make the cannon as big and stupid as we need to obtain the desired performance. Did I say big and stupid? What I meant to add was completely batshit insane. To understand the challenges of obtaining omnidirectional firing, let's look at the acceleration stage of the latest iteration of the orbital strike cannon. We're going to be drawing upon a lot of ideas introduced previously in videos like the incredible science of the orbital strike cannon, so be sure to watch that first to keep up to date with the latest knowledge. The payload we want to accelerate is in the corner of our lazy chunks to bring it as close as possible to the corners of the adjacent entity processing chunks. The propelling TNT is created, aligned, and delayed for the 4 seconds required to burn down the fuse time. This ensures by the time the TNT reaches the blast zone, it will explode the instant it is put into position. This is important because these dupers are really fast, generating up to 10 TNT every 6 game tick, or about 33 TNT per second. In order to make the targeting of the cannon flexible, we need to accelerate in both the X and the Z direction. However, this means that we need to have 2 batches of TNT come very close to each other such that the explosion of one will actually affect the alignment of the other. However, in the orbital strike cannon, we mitigate this issue by offsetting the dupers for each axis by 3 game ticks, and then aligning the TNT in such a way that within that 3 game tick time, when the explosion happens, the other batch of TNT is protected by blocks and so isn't affected by the explosion. However, if I remove the protective blocks, like so, now watch what happens. There we go, the explosion of one batch of TNT is now affecting the alignment of the next batches of TNT to come through, which means all hell's now going to break loose. So the problem is you have extremely tight tolerances for how you can position the TNT, and these fast alignment dupers barely manage to accelerate our payload in one set of XZ directions. So you can imagine how difficult it would be to obtain all 4. This is why for the Hellstorm cannon, I'm going to try something completely different. Instead of placing our payload in the corner of the lazy chunks, and having the accelerating TNT placed right next to it in the entity processing chunks, I'm going to take the payload and move it deep inside the lazy chunks like so. I'm then going to use 2 batches of TNT in the acceleration stage. Both batches of TNT were created at the same time but in a specific order. The first batch of TNT is aligned to the center of this wall and sits half a block offset from the ground. The second batch is about a pixel further in front and sits slightly higher on top of the stone cutter. Using Subtick by Intricate and Spacewalker, we can step through each TNT entity one by one to see how this works. In this really neat HUD provided by the Subtick mod, we can see all of the entities being processed in this Minecraft world. Looking at entities 3 to 12, those are in the first batch of TNT, and number 13 is the second batch, which is going to be accelerated forwards. By running the command qstep entity 1, we then start ticking through each one of the individual TNT entities. And here you can see from logging the explosions, the effect that the explosion has on other entities. In this first row, we have the first TNT that explodes in the first batch, trying to influence the other 9 TNT in its own batch. However, because all of these TNT are in exactly the same position, their influence on each other is effectively nullified. However, the TNT in the second batch gets accelerated, being positioned slightly forwards. If we go ahead and Q-step again, we then accelerate the second batch slightly more, and you can see the amount of TNT in our first batch is decreasing as each one explodes. And as we step through each one of the TNT, we finally get to the point where all the TNT in the first batch has exploded. And now, if we run Q-step one last time, our TNT receiving all of that knockback from the explosions has accumulated enough velocity to instantly zip through the chunk border and explode inside of our lazy chunks right next to where our payload will be positioned. Now watch what happens when we take this approach and combine it into dual axis acceleration. First, all the TNT from one axis goes, accelerating our payload, which is this waterlogged scaffolding, in one of the directions. But notice how all of the explosions are happening completely out of range of the TNT in our second axis. So now we can step through all of the TNT from the other direction, and the result, our payload moves perfectly in the direction we want it to. If we go ahead and increase the amount of TNT in one of the axes, we accelerate the TNT slightly further so that it goes ahead of our payload, accelerating it in the negative direction. So when we go ahead and process the next set, like so, and take the combined velocity, our scaffolding moves in a different direction, and bumping up the alignment for both axes. And we get acceleration in the negative direction. This approach of using TNT to accelerate the TNT to accelerate the payload is a bit insane, but ensures we obtain linearly independent thrust vectoring in every possible direction. With this in mind, I've gone ahead and whipped up a prototype for the cannon for Operation Hellstorm. Just like with the orbital strike cannon, we can input our various count settings in the X and the Z axes, but now we also have the option to flip each axis from positive to negative. Let's set up for something like 100 counts, then start up the dupers to see how everything works. So our primary batch is provided by these two dupers, which aligns the TNT to the side so it's in the center of the block. Then we have the secondary duper, which aligns the TNT against these chests, meaning when we get down to the blast point, you can see there are explosions happening here, and then our second batch gets accelerated over here to where the blast point is. To prevent the primary charge from dealing block damage, all we need is a lava source where it explodes. However, the secondary charge explodes over here in completely empty space. We don't even need to bother nullifying the blast damage, because all we need to do is just avoid putting blocks in this area. Let's do a demonstration of how the cannon will actually work, because it's actually really cool. Let's take away this 100 count and put something like 20 in each axis. At the bottom of the cannon, we have this portal which represents where we'll receive our falling block entities from the overworld. I go ahead and spawn them in. We'll use something known as the corner portal technique to deliver our falling block entities directly into lazy chunks. The corner portal technique will be covered in detail in a future video. I've also gone ahead and disabled chunk loading for my player, so now you can see that the cannon is chunk loading itself. Let's go ahead and start the alignment process. And now this flying machine is launched at the same time as a flying machine above it, and these two will meet in the middle at the blast point, where it will deliver our falling scaffolding blocks. So now they are floating, suspended in our lazy chunks, away from any blocks that will be damaged by the TNT. Here we go, here comes our TNT. If we disable particles, we can also see the ray casting of the TNT onto our falling block entities. Once the momentum transfer is complete, here comes our flying machine. Let's disable entity ticking and re-enable chunk loading, just so our client can properly render the entities. So keep in mind, we actually have two scaffolding entities here, and we use this section of the machine to separate them out and align them into an infinite water source. So now, when the scaffolding goes to land at the target destination, it will already be in the configuration necessary to form an infinite water source. The last step of the process is to deliver the scaffolding all the way to the top of the world, where we have the powdered snow where we release our falling block entities. There we go. All that's left to do now is to enable entity ticking and watch as our falling scaffolding blocks fly to the target destination, where they'll immediately start falling from the sky and land exactly where you want them to be. And just like that, you have a glorified orbital water cannon. The next step is to test the setup in 1.21 to make sure that it actually works. Wouldn't it be awesome if it turned out that it just straight up didn't work? The reason why I didn't just design it in 1.21 is that it's a fairly new version and all the mods that I need to design stuff aren't actually available yet. However, we do have some basic tools like Tweakeru, so we can disable anti-ticking and have a look at the forbidden zone where our falling block entities are stored. So here is the platform where we would generate the Warlock falling scaffolding blocks in 1.19 and then launch them into unloaded chunks over there. Let's go ahead and run the command data get entity, and oh my god, in 1.21 we can just use a delimiter @n to find the nearest entity. There we go. Yep, our falling Warlock scaffolding blocks are still there. We just make sure that anti-ticking is disabled. We can fly over and have a look at them. Here they are. So right now they're behaving as if they're in unloaded chunks. If we have a look at the entity counter, we have 258 of the Warlock falling scaffolding blocks in this storage right here. And this is the setup we use to get them into the nether dimension. When we want to actually use the cannon in the nether, all we need to do is send a minecart through this portal, and that is how we signal the overworld side to dispatch 2 of the Warlock scaffolding blocks through this portal, which will deliver them straight into the alignment system of the cannon. Let's punch in something like 20 counts in the X direction, punch it in, and of course with all of these chunk loading safeties, the cannon will now wait until the player leaves the area before it starts preparing the payload. As usual, we use the game rules spectators generate chunks false, and that way we can go into spectator, and our player will no longer load the area. And there are our falling Warlock scaffolding entities. 2 of them just come through the portal, and now they're getting aligned. And so begins the firing sequence. Now, because I don't have all of my diagnostic tools, unfortunately my client is being a bit wonky with the rendering of the entities. There we go, TNT is finished. Separate the payloads and prime the momentum cancellation. Let's go ahead and disable anti-ticking. Go back into creative. Alright, we can't actually see the payload, but if I go ahead and enable ticking again, yep, there's our falling Warlock scaffolding. Hey! Looks like everything's working. So provided nothing gets changed, Operation Hellstorm is a go. However, we're still missing something. When I input a count, like 20, I actually don't have any idea where the water sources are going to land. To make this connection, we need to analyze the velocity profile of the cannon and derive a formula to transform the coordinate space of our nether dimension into the amount of TNT space of our cannon. Let's take one of the axes, say the positive X, set the count to a nice round value like 10, and set the trim to 0. The dupes for each axis have a capacity of 10 TNT, and so, with 10 counts of 10 TNT, that gives us exactly 100 TNT. The trim would then add an additional amount of TNT on top of that, ranging from 0 to 10. So for example, if I set the trim to 7, we'll then be duping 107 TNT. However, let's keep it at a nice round value of 100. All that's left to do now is load the settings into the cannon and let it do its thing. Once the payload is ready, we can just grab the motion using a command, and that will be our motion for 100 TNT in the positive X direction. Repeating this for the negative X direction, and it's interesting to note that the velocity we get is slightly different. This means the acceleration of our payload is not perfectly symmetric in every single direction. But that's fine because our formula will account for that and give us the correct settings for whatever position we want. After testing exactly 100 TNT in all 4 directions, you can see the result being our scaffolding spread around the cannon in each cardinal direction. For our numerical results, we obtain the motion of our payload for exactly 100 TNT in each cardinal direction. We will start by discarding the Y motion, which we don't use. We also need to make sure that we apply the drag incurred by the powder snow, and what we are left with is perfectly accurate data depicting the distance our payload will travel for each test. The next step is to derive the formula for aiming the cannon using a matrix equation. If we abbreviate our variables into coefficients, we can better simplify the problem. We know the amount of TNT we use in each test, and we know the resulting motion we get from that amount of TNT. What we don't know are these four coefficients which transform the motion space into the amount of TNT space. However, you might notice a problem. We have four unknowns but only two equations defining the relationship between them. Therefore, to solve this equation, we will need to combine the results from two of our tests, and the results we use depend on the domain in which the cannon is aiming. For example, in the domain of positive x and positive z, we will combine test results for those directions to obtain a unique solution for that domain. We still have four unknowns, but with the combined power of two test results, we also have four equations describing the relationship between those unknowns. Thus, we can derive a linear system of equations for which the solution are these quotients in terms of our known variables. A great way to simplify the solution is to test each direction independently, meaning the counts for the z-axis and the positive z test are 0 and vice versa. Computing the numerical results for the positive xz domain gives us these coefficients. We then repeat the process for all four domains around the cannon, and what we obtain is the fire control matrix, which is built from the 2x2 coefficient matrices from our four domains. If we take this matrix, then multiply it by a set of xz coordinates, what we obtain is 4 pairs of TNT quantities needed in the xz axes of the cannon. However, we must choose the correct pair of settings for the domain where our target is located. A simple way to do this is to look at the xz coordinates and simply match the sign of the coordinates with the sign of the domain. But this assumes the domains are nice and square like this, meaning if I pick a coordinate here, then obviously we use the positive xz domain. However, our domains are skewed by the tiny asymmetry in each axis and look more like this, which means now the point we chose is in fact in the positive x, negative z domain. This was actually a huge problem for the first iteration of the orbital strike cannon, where the alignment caused a substantial skewness in the cannon's velocity profile, which meant that targets chosen in regions near domain boundaries would give you incorrect instructions for firing. This is why in the new fire control program for the Hellstorm cannon, we will perform a proper domain check to eliminate those edge cases. So you can see here the position of the cannon, the target coordinates, the displacement, which is the target minus the origin of the cannon, the domain boundaries, the fire control matrix, and our 4 pairs of results from a computation. With a bit of Excel logic, we then select the correct settings for the domain and clearly display the required settings for each axis of the cannon and the estimated time to charge the payload. If a setting comes out negative, you simply flip the lever to set that axis from positive to negative. So let's do a test firing towards the coordinates 0, 0 in the nether. In the Z, we get a count of 5, 20, 6, and a trim of 10. In the X, we get a count of 3, 20, 5, and a trim of 4. Now we can simply punch in the settings and let the cannon do its thing. There we go. Now if we load the cannon, teleport ourselves to the target. There are our falling Warlock scaffolding blocks. Ah crap. So it turns out that because our scaffolding entities aren't perfectly aligned to the position of the blocks they're landing on, you can see that this scaffolding entity slightly protrudes into this block space, while this scaffolding entity has the center of its feet position over this block. So what's going to happen is this scaffolding is going to fall and land on this space right here, and when it does so, it converts into a scaffolding block which has a solid top surface and therefore the second entity to land, which is slightly protruding into the first entity's space, collides with the top surface of the scaffolding and causes it to instantly break into an item. That kind of sucks. Fortunately, the solution is as simple as separating our falling block entities at least half a block from each other, which means no matter where our payload lands, the falling block entities will never collide with each other. Now unfortunately, this does mean that at some target locations, the resulting water sources will be spaced slightly further apart. However, this is a lot better than the chance of losing a water source entirely. That pretty much wraps up everything quite nicely. We have the cannon working in 1.21 and ready to be implemented on the WaveTech server. It will still be a little while before this happens, however, and we have effectively learnt everything there is to know about the concept, from obtaining waterlogged falling scaffolding to launching it around the nether with an orbital strike cannon. Plus, there is currently a huge survival project underway on the WaveTech SMP, so you can look forward to that video coming out soon. But I will certainly revisit the Hellstorm cannon and implement the methodology to make a new and improved orbital strike cannon with full omnidirectional firing. It will just take some time to compact the Jupiter layout and implement the payload encoder. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching and I will see you next time.